Thank you very much for the invitation to speak. Can you all hear me?
Yes.
So I'm afraid it is once again asking you to look down, look up, but also to look down, so to speak. But at least you've been saved a paper on chestfuls of soil, which was the alternative. So we're all used, I think, to ground plans. Small scale, two-dimensional representations of the footprint of a three-dimensional building, a horizontal slice through a structure. We use them to locate ourselves in our current built environment. We use them to imagine a building we've never seen. And we use them to imagine a structure that is yet to be built, or was planned and never built, or was built and has been lost or altered. Of course, such plans were not absent from medieval visual culture, although they were considerably more rare. In a lecture to the British Archaeological Association, I need hardly mention architectural plans for the creation of new buildings. Plans were also drawn of prominent structures in the Holy Land, such as the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, which amongst other things allowed those reading written descriptions to better understand the text. And there's even the case of the temple in Jerusalem, which combines the projected and the distant. Some plans relate not to Solomon's structure, but Ezekiel's vision, in which an angel measured out the dimensions of the future building. Mary Carruthers has written about medieval building descriptions and dimensions as a prompt to creative imaginatio. And of course, there's always an act of imaginative addition with any ground plan to fill in the structure above. But this evening, I want to ask you to join me in an act of mental effort in the other direction, one of mental subtraction, and to disengage the familiar two-dimensional ground plan from the three-dimensional building, or at least to prise them apart just a little. Because the ground plans I'd like to talk about were drawn on the ground, and the small-scale plans that we're going to be looking at on the screen relate first and foremost to that two-dimensional drawing. In other words, the representations relate to their subject matter rather as the image of a football pitch relates to the pitch as it's marked out on the ground. I was going to provide an image of a football pitch, and then I thought everyone could provide that for themselves. The analogy isn't exact, but I do find it helps when imagining a plan without a superstructure. So in what follows, I'm going to discuss medieval church plans drawn on the ground, not so much in terms of the building that will follow them, but in terms of representation. More specifically, I'd like to consider the ground as both a surface for representation and the subject of representation. I'll start with descriptions and depictions of miraculous, divinely executed plans, and then move on to liturgical practices and their illustration. My ultimate argument, or at least my hunch, is that these intersected to form a type of ground plan associated with the demarcation of sacred space, but also the idea of the church as a spiritual as well as a physical edifice. First of all then, to consider the ground as a surface for miraculous marking. From the 9th century onwards, foundation legends in the medieval West include examples in which the plan of the church to be was marked on the ground through divine intervention. Often the plan was delineated in familiar natural media such as dew, frost or snow, although it might also involve acts of impression. Biblical precedents for the divine provision of plans can be found in both the Old and New Testaments. I've already mentioned Ezekiel's vision in which an angel measures out the dimensions of the future temple. Of course, there was also the dream in Revelation in which an angel does likewise for the heavenly Jerusalem. But these involve instructions pertaining to all three dimensions of the structures concerned. So for the miraculous ground plans, in which primarily two-dimensional information was given, as important a precedent was the story of Gideon's fleece. Here, in a sign that God would save Israel, a fleece laid on the ground one evening was found the next day to be full of dew, while the ground around it was dry. Conversely, the next night the fleece was dry, while the ground around it was covered with dew. Now, the place where the fleece had been laid was not followed by any construction activity on the site. Indeed, the miracle didn't have the purpose of designating the location as sacred, but the story provided a divinely produced means of delineating space on the ground and was, as we'll see, explicitly invoked as a comparison. And I've simply chosen this example from the Kutnahora Cancional because I think the sheep is looking as expectantly up into the heavens as Gideon himself. Early examples of the plan marked in dew similarly envisage it as a simple binary between interior and exterior. One case is found in the Revelatio Sancti Michaelis, a 9th century text describing the founding of Mont Saint-Michel in Normandy. Here, Bishop and Saint Aubert was commanded in a dream to construct a church in honour of the Archangel Michael, with Aubert's hesitancy provoking several interventions on the part of the angel. And you see here a scene from a later version of the legend in which the angel prods Saint Aubert in the head for good measure. The size and dimensions of the place needed for the church were determined first by the circular area marked out by the hoofprints of a bull, and secondly, when the bishop was still hesitating on account of the large size of the church, by dew on the summit of the mount. And in an occurrence which is explicitly compared to Gideon's sign of victory, the area where the foundations were to be was left dry, and the bishop was told to go and lay the foundations as you see them marked out, signatum. Where the Mont Saint-Michel plan determines the size of the church, those in other legends could address its shape. In the 9th century life of Saint Egile, abbot of Rebais in the Ile-de-France, the saint deliberately sought a divine revelation concerning the site of the church to be built. Praying alone, he saw a cruciform cloud in the air, as well as dew in the form of a cross on the ground. And these two remained for 3 days, allowing the abbot and the local bishop to place the foundations of the church, which was built in schemata crucis. Now, it's possible that the cloud was conceived on the model of the pillar of cloud in Exodus and should therefore be imagined as vertical. But it's equally possible that it was understood to be horizontal, mirroring and reinforcing that on the ground. Later foundation legends employ the motif of dew or snow in which lines are traced, so coming perhaps closer to the idea of plan as we think of it. For example, in an account of the foundation of the Benedictine Abbey at Soignies, the 11th century life of St. Vincent Madalgarius recounts how the saint experienced a dream, shown here, in which an angel instructed him to build a church in honour of St. Peter, marking the dimensions of the building by walking around the site, drawing a reed after him. The plan of the church, Vestigium Basilicae here, was later found to be indicated by the absence of dew on the grass where the angel had trodden. And while vestigium can mean any kind of trace or imprint, it's perhaps significant in this context that it's consistently used to describe the venerated footprints of Christ, saints, and angels, suggesting that the angelic steps that delineated the building also rendered it holy. Similarly, a 12th century account of the restoration of the Abbey of Mozac describes a vision in which an angel in the guise of a white deer marked the form of the church to be built with its horns and hooves, creating a vestigium visible in both the snow and in the earth beneath. The king, seeing these vestigia, ordered that a basilica of marvellous size should be built on the spot. Where angels and deer acted as divine emissaries, more direct intervention was also possible. At Hildesheim, the late 11th century Fundatio Ecclesiae Hildensiensis describes how the bishop and clergy implored God to show them the place where they should build their church. And at dawn on the fourth day, they saw boundary lines, limites, marked out in spring frost, measuring a skillfully made rectangle for the excavation of the foundations of the church. And this is quite a detailed plan. In this case, the lines are described as being wide and long and distant from one another in such a manner as to indicate the thickness of the walls and the length of the church and its capacity. In all these cases, the marking out of the plan is understood as a precursor to the digging of the foundations, which is carried out by human actors. But occasionally, miraculous help was also provided with those. For example, the mid-9th century Liber Pontificalis for Ravenna contains an account of the foundation of a church dedicated to St. Zacharias some centuries earlier, in which the niece of Galla Placidia was instructed by an elderly man in a vision to build a monasterium in the place where she would find it traced out, designatum, while the altar was to be positioned where she found the likeness of a cross in the ground. When she went to the spot, she found the foundations already dug, as if excavated by a human hand, and she proceeded to build as she had found it drawn out, which suggests that the foundations themselves were understood as showing the form of the church. As a number of art historians have discussed, these and similar building miracles may have functioned to legitimise potentially contentious construction activity and to position the recipients of these visionary experiences in a line of prominent building patrons. Such miracles have also been employed to reconstruct actual construction techniques. However, my interest in the legend lies more in the acts of drawing on and imprinting the surface of the ground in and of themselves. And in this respect, I think it's suggestive that a ground plan could be detached from a conventional building and given a different relationship with the three-dimensional space above it. In legendary accounts of the life of the Apostle Thomas, he agrees to build a palace for the Indian king Gundoforus, and takes a reed, measures the place, and marks it out. However, rather than proceed with the building, he spends the money on the poor instead. When the king comes to ask why there is no sign of the promised palace, Thomas explains that his actions have constructed for the king a palace in heaven instead. This is the moment in the narrative which we see depicted in this early 14th century Dominican breviary, with Gundoforus pointing down, presumably where he expected work to be commencing, and Thomas pointing up at a golden palace, its ecclesiastical appearance perhaps suggestive of its spiritual nature. The idea that a plan marked on the ground, our ground, could have a heavenly, spiritual or disembodied superstructure is one that I'll return to. But for the moment, in the case of the legends with divinely provided plans, separating the miraculous marking of the ground from the subsequent act of building allows us better to understand the status of these marks as akropoeta, works not made by human hands, and to better contextualise their potential to generate further two-dimensional representations as well as three-dimensional buildings. And it's these representations that I'd like to explore next. So whether miraculous or manufactured, plans drawn or imprinted on the ground constitute an act of image-making in their own right. The authors of the verbal descriptions that we've gone through are clearly interested in the nature of these images. They note media, dimensions, shapes, even the thickness of the lines, allowing the reader to form a relatively vivid mental image of the marks on the ground. But it won't have escaped your notice that so far none of the examples I've discussed have been represented visually. This changes substantially with one particular example, the miraculous foundation of the Church of Santa Maria Maggiore in Rome. The earliest known account is given in the second redaction of Bartolomeo da Trento's Liber Epilogorum in Gesta Sanctorum, which has been dated to 1254. According to Bartolomeo, at the time of Constantine, a wealthy, childless Roman couple asked God how they should dispose of their wealth. The Virgin appeared to them to request a church in her honour, indicating its extent and site by an unseasonal covering of snow, and then making this known to Pope Liberius. The next morning the snow was discovered, and the Pope was the first to break the ground in order to lay the foundations. But in a second miracle, the earth yielded by itself. Effectively, the foundations opened up of their own accord. And you can see more or less this sequence of events in a 17th century drawing of the late 13th or early 14th century facade mosaics at Santa Maria Maggiore, although these inevitably give rather greater prominence to the Pope. So they lead with the Pope's vision. Then you have that of John and his wife. Then you have John going to see the Pope, and finally you have the ground plan itself, and also the Pope in the act of starting the foundations. So the plan in the Santa Maria Maggiore legend, especially as this developed in the early 14th century, brings together a range of elements that we have already encountered separately in the legends with which I started. The snow both covers the entirety of the area to be built on, being explicitly compared again to the dew on Gideon's fleece, and it indicates the confines, the limites of the space, same word used. The miracle not only includes a plan marked in snow by the Virgin, but also divinely imprinted foundations. Moreover, it also shows an awareness of the tradition of the heavenly mansion marked out by St. Thomas. During the Virgin's appearance to the patrician John, she promises that while he and his wife are building a house for her on earth, she will construct for them an eternal dwelling in heaven. It might be going too far to suggest that the snowfall thus functions as the plan for both the church to be built on the Esquiline and the heavenly home of its patrons. However, the two-dimensional plan marked on the surface of the ground can certainly be seen to operate in relation to two three-dimensional spaces positioned vertically above it, representing different modes of realization. The physical structure of the church building on earth, which itself prefigures the eternal mansion in heaven. The facade mosaics, variously dated to either side of 1300, are the earliest visualization of a miraculous ground plan of which I am aware. If you know of any others, please let me know. However, unfortunately, the last scene has been truncated by the addition of the facade, and the original appearance of the mosaics further disrupted by repairs and restoration over the centuries. So currently, the plan is rather misshapen, missing both the east end of the church and the right arm of the transept, although the outline shows where it must have been. So I think here we've got an indication of where changes have been made. Nevertheless, the chalk drawing gives a plausible rendition of what the plan may have looked like originally, with a rounded apse and transept, and also shows Liberius with hoe in hand. The form of the plan raises interesting questions in relation to the actual church of Santa Maria Maggiore, which had only just been given a transept under Pope Nicholas IV, destroying the early Christian East End while simultaneously providing the church with a feature strongly associated with early Christian architecture. Yet it also seems possible that the designer of the mosaics didn't intend to represent Santa Maria Maggiore with any degree of archaeological accuracy, but rather to show something that was easily readable as the ground plan of a church. So when describing the shape of a church in his Rationale Divinorum Officiorum, William Durandus only glossed two, circular and cruciform, and with respect to the latter, he noted that some churches are built in the form of a cross to show that we should crucify ourselves to the world, or that we should follow the way of the cross. As Henk van Os and others have shown, the Santa Maria Maggiore facade mosaics were the first of a number of representations of the miracle of the snow. As the feast spread throughout Italy and beyond, churches were dedicated to Santa Maria ad Nives and confraternities founded in her honour. And although not all of these show the plan, a significant number do. And they mainly show the snow covering the place to be occupied by the church. So the foundation scene is similar but not identical to that in the facade mosaics in an early 15th century altarpiece by Masolino, which was originally in Santa Maria Maggiore. Here the plan is positioned centrally with figures to either side, and transepts and a rounded apse are visible on the right. Liberius is shown marking out the foundations with a hoe, with attendants pulling his robes sensibly out of the way. And kind of remember that gesture, please. In a historiated initial from a Tuscan choir book dating to the late 14th and early 15th centuries, the Pope is shown raising a hand in blessing, while two workmen do the digging. The east end of the church is hidden from view, but again the transept clearly indicated. Plans are also shown in isolation, ranging from the simple footprint in a 15th century Augustinian breviary at the bottom left, to the very complex tri-lobed east end in an antiphonary from Chiusi Cathedral on the right. And interestingly, some of the earliest representations of the miracle delineate the outlines of the building as well, allowing for an indication of doorways and interior elements. So at the Franciscan chapter house at Pistoia, in a fresco dating to around 1390, the plan again features a rounded apse and transept. But the ground both inside and outside the perimeter of the church is shown speckled with snow, and the outlines of the building are delineated by a white line, with the altar denoted by a white rectangle. It's not very clear, but I hope you can just make that out there. And in a Florentine antiphonary dated to around the same period, the outlines of the building are also delineated, with spaces conveniently left for the west entrance and the side doors. So the Virgin is, developing architecturally speaking. All these representations give an indication of the sorts of mental images which might have been inspired by the earlier textual accounts of divinely inspired ground plans. But the question remains as to why the Santa Maria Maggiore mosaic was seemingly the first attempt to depict such a plan. Some of the answer must lie in the legend itself, with its double miracle of plan and foundations. And much of the explanation surely lies within Rome, with its dynamic of competition between the great churches and families of the city. These churches not only featured foundation scenes in prominent public positions, but also boasted miraculously created images, notably the Lateran icon of Christ and the Veronica. Recognising the snowy plan and divinely opened foundations as acropoeta to set alongside these helps explain the desire to fix them in the more durable medium of mosaic. However, this evening I want to focus on another possible prompt and source of inspiration, and that is contemporary liturgical practice at building sites. So there'd long been a process for sanctioning the site of a new church. Indeed, it seems probable that the early miraculous plans mirror and replace that ceremony. The early medieval procedure, which originated in Justinian's Novellae and was expanded in the Romano-Germanic Pontifical, involved the bishop publicly fixing a cross in the spot where the altar would be situated and then sprinkling the site with holy water. Arguably, we see both these elements reflected in the life of St. Agile, in which the site of the church is marked out in dew on the ground and a cross-shaped cloud in the sky, and that perhaps tending towards envisaging that cloud as an upright structure. A separate ceremony developed around the laying of the first stone in the foundations, in which lay founders could play a prominent role. However, from the 12th and especially the 13th century, there's evidence of increasing ecclesiastical control over this as well. In the mid-12th century, John Belleth noted the placing of the first stone and the asperging of the foundations, and a fuller passage can be found in the Mitral of Sicardus of Cremona. Roman pontificals of the 13th century include two short blessings, one of the first stone and one of a stone for the building of a church. And in this late 13th century example, possibly used at the Lateran, both are provided with historiated initials. The first one shows the bishop blessing a round sort of egg-shaped stone, while the second depicts him leaning over to bless the ground at his feet with just the suggestion of an opening. Sorry, I can't work this. Well, you can see it. And this might reflect a desire to indicate the stone in situ, but it perhaps also suggests that the foundations themselves were of significance. The designation of the site and the blessing of the foundations seem first to have been joined together in a liturgical book in the Pontifical of William Durandus, a compilation made in the 1290s which became very popular in the 14th century. So where the Romano-Germanic Pontifical focuses on the site of the altar, this gives more of a sense of the form of the church, stating that no one should build a church before the place and atrium are marked out, designator, by the judgment of the bishop. And it then goes on to stipulate that the cross should be erected on the site of the altar, and on the next day the first stone laid in the foundations. After this, the bishop sprinkles holy water on all the foundations if they're open, and if they're not yet open, he circles and asperges the whole place marked out, again designata, for the foundations of the church. It is difficult to know what exactly is meant by loca ad fundamenta designata. It could simply mean the place appointed for the foundations, or it could refer to a place visibly marked or traced out on the ground. Of course, even with the foundations already opened, we shouldn't imagine that they necessarily included an entire church building. Nevertheless, given the stage at which the ceremony takes place, the form of the church is likely to be more evident, and the liturgy certainly displays a greater interest in it than was possible in the initial marking of the site prescribed in the Romano-Germanic Pontifical. And this tiny but highly detailed initial in an early 14th century French Durandus Pontifical may give a sense of this marking out of the site in showing the light green ground marked with a darker green square with two small white crosses. So here, and those little crosses there. It's possible, therefore, that both the account and visualisation of the Roman miracle of the snow was partly informed by growing ecclesiastical control over sanctifying rituals and building sites, which included the circling and asperging of the foundations as well as the laying of the first stone. Through the double miracle of the snowy ground plan and the divinely opened foundations, the legend actually brings together the two moments of liturgical involvement in a site. Moreover, not only do contemporary Roman pontificals of the Roman Curia, so pontificals of the Roman Curia actually made in and around Rome, illustrate the blessing of the first stone, despite its relatively short textual treatment, but in 1290 Pope Nicholas IV himself went down into the foundations for Orvieto Cathedral and laid the first stone. The reception of the miracle, too, suggests that it was seen in terms of this rite. The German version of the late 15th century Historia Descriptio Urbis Romae explicitly states that Liberius laid the first stone. And in this scene showing the legend in the early 15th century Breviary of Mary of Savoy, one of the builders conspicuously holds a single stone to which the Pope gestures, suggesting that the ceremony was also in the mind of the artist. And really, apart from the figure of Mary right up at the top, it would be easy to take this as an illustration of the rite rather than of the miracle. As far as I'm aware, no representation of the form of the foundations is found in pontificals that predate the mosaics. So any influence on the visualization of the miraculous ground plan must come from the ceremony and the markings on the surface of the ground itself. But I think a close relationship between the two is suggested, confirmed by the fact that when this aspect of the rite does come to be depicted in pontificals, the format seems to be informed by the tradition of miraculous Marian plans. So at least 3 manuscript pontificals, all produced in northern Italy, show the foundations as a plan without any attention to the first stone. The earliest, and in a sense the most remarkable, is this late 14th century pontifical of the Roman Curia, possibly from Modena. So here, even though the text of this manuscript only refers to the blessing of the first stone, the bishop is shown blessing the outline of a church with the foundations filled in with stones. This takes the form of the eastern half of a simple basilica positioned with the apse to the left. Given the nature of the text, it's probable that the artist had in mind images in Durandus pontificals which explicitly called for episcopal attention to the foundations or place marked out for them. And certainly the 2 other examples of ground plans I've found so far come in pontificals that do contain the canon Nemo Ecclesiam Edificate and relevant rituals, even though those manuscripts are of a later date. So one is a pontifical made in the 1450s in Bergamo for Bishop Giovanni Barozzi, which draws largely on Durandus's pontifical. And this provides a more elaborate representation, showing the whole outline of a basilica with apse and transept, positioned with the east end pointing away from the viewer this time. The bishop kneels in the centre, facing a cross set in the location of the altar. I think it's quite difficult here to tell whether the foundations are being envisaged as marked, dug, or filled in, or shown as a low wall already. But a space has again been left for the west door, so down there, and the impression is very much that of a tangible imprint on the landscape. The ground within and beyond the foundations is rocky, there are mountains in the distance. A third approach is found in a pontifical of around 1490, thought to have been produced in Venice and now in the Houghton Library. And this is a manuscript copy of the 1485 Editio Princeps of the Pontificale Romanum, a revision of Durandus's pontifical, which nevertheless repeats his blessing of the first stone almost letter for letter. So in fact, these 3 plans are found in 3 different types of pontifical, even though closely related. So here, in a rectangular miniature, the bishop and clergy stand facing a plan of a church marked out on the ground. Set in a green landscape, the whole plan is filled in with a brown wash, and you can see it's that of a basilica with an apse and no transept. With perhaps, again though, some concern that people should be able to enter the church. So I think that might be a vestigial door there. And the bishop, his robes held out of the way by the man behind him, holds a hoe in both hands, poised to bring it down on the earth. The representation of the foundations in the form of a ground plan in these 3 Italian pontificals suggests, I think, an awareness of contemporary Italian depictions of the miraculous ground plan of Santa Maria Maggiore. Since there were many other ways of illustrating this part of the rite, which I haven't put up on the screen this evening, the choice to depict a plan in only this geographical area is likely to be more than coincidental. the presence of the two subjects in liturgical manuscripts created a context in which knowledge could circulate, and illuminators might well have had experience of representing both. There was considerable variety in both spheres. The plan could be shown partially or in full, in different orientations, and emphasising the outline or the area covered. All the solutions in the pontificals find correspondences in representations of the snowy ground plan, although not necessarily in the same combination. Perhaps the closest visual relationship can be posited for the Houghton pontifical, because the miniature here is highly reminiscent of depictions of Liberius marking out the foundations of Santa Maria Maggiore, and may well reflect direct engagement with such a scene. I think the treatment of the bishop with hoe in hand is particularly suggestive, because the liturgy doesn't call for the bishop to take part in the breaking of the ground. So just as the breviary of Mary of Savoy could be mistaken for a depiction of the blessing of the first stone, were it not for the presence of Mary, so the Houghton pontifical image could be taken for a depiction of the miracle of the snow, especially since some representations of Pope Liberius opening the foundations didn't show Mary either. I think it must have been pontificals such as these that informed the better known and widely used printed pontificals of the early 16th century. A set of pontificals produced in Venice by the Junta Press devote a series of woodcut scenes to the blessings of the foundations and foundation stone. Two versions of the scenes exist, one in the editions of 1520 and 43, which I'm showing you here, and the others from editions of 50 in the 1560s and 70s. So in the scene illustrating the blessing of the holy water up at the top, the plan of the church is marked out on the ground with a cross on the site of the altar. In the next scene, bottom left, the foundations are dug, with the foundation stone marked by a cross shown being passed to the bishop by the mason. And finally, we see the procession around the site of the church with the bishop asperging the foundations, which are now filled in. Of course, the scene showing the blessing of the holy water with the ground plan is particularly interesting in the present context. In both cases, the plan is schematic, a cruciform church with a round apse. So that's the later edition as well. The outline of the walls is shown in a manner differentiated from the finished foundations, which are filled in with stones in the final scene, and a more subtle distinction can also be drawn with the foundation trench as depicted in the scenes of the laying of the first stone, where I think there is a clear suggestion of depth. The plan may simply indicate to the viewer that this is the site of the church, using a sign which functions with reference to plans on paper. Yet they seem to be more of an integral part of the landscape than that, and there are even tufts of grass in the centre of the plan in the later editions. And so I'd like to suggest that they can be seen to represent the loca ad fundamenta designata as a plan drawn on the ground. The immediate source of inspiration is most likely, as I've said, to have been an illuminated manuscript pontifical with a representation of the foundation along the lines of the three discussed, especially those that showed the outline of the church. But at the same time, it's possible that the artist was also aware of images of the Marian ground plans depicting the limites of the church. Directly or indirectly then, the depiction of the miraculous ground plan and foundations at Santa Maria Maggiore was not only likely informed by contemporary liturgical interest in the site of a church to be, but in its turn influenced the way in which this was depicted. The resulting pictorial tradition of a schematic, often cruciform plan drawn on the ground is not only shared by these two contexts, but is almost exclusive to them. It can therefore be suggested to have had associations with divine and ecclesiastical sanction, to be a holy ground plan, in other words. Compared to small-scale plans that represented a horizontal slice through a structure, an imprint of a building, such plans also bore a different relationship to the three-dimensional space above them, conceived of as both more extensive and less material. So if you remember, the plan of Santa Maria Maggiore was not only drawn from heaven, but could act as the ground plan for a dwelling in heaven. Similarly, the liturgical marking out of the site had less to do with the practical form of the structure to follow, and more with designating that church as a spiritual edifice, which the consecration ceremony to come would compare to the human soul. In fact, from another perspective, and bearing in mind contemporary architectural plans and drawings, to be honest, the only edifice these plans would allow you to build was a spiritual one. The distinction between small-scale ground plans of buildings and small-scale depictions of plans drawn on the ground can be illustrated by a final comparison between two much later images showing a ground plan in a landscape setting. One, a 17th century engraving showing the conversion of St. Eustace, makes use of a ground plan to indicate the church that would subsequently be built on the site. Used as the frontispiece to Athanasius Kircher's Historia Eustachio Mariana in 1665, it was subsequently included in his Latium of 1671. The saint is shown looking up at the stag with a cross between its antlers, which prompted his conversion to Christianity, and he stands at, or rather on, the entrance to the plan of the church, which is a complex design with side chapels and, significantly, I think, a suggestion of vaulting. It really seems like a paper plan that's been introduced into the landscape. And I've simply put up a plan of Milan Cathedral in Cesare Cesariano's commentary on Vitruvius as a very loose comparison, but simply because of the vaulting. But despite appearances, this isn't an example of a foundation legend in which the form of the church is indicated by visionary or miraculous means. Eustace himself received no command to build a church, which was supposed by Kircher to have been founded by Constantine and restored by St. Benedict. Kircher was responsible for the rebuilding of the shrine, and the plan corresponds to that of the structure in his time. It doesn't represent lines marked on the ground. In contrast, this is my final image, a ground plan corresponding to the type represented in the context of miracles and foundation ritual can be found in an early 17th century emblem book of the Regia Via Crucis by Benedict van Heften. Here, figures personifying the human soul and divine love, aided by an angel, use the cross to reconstruct a ruined church, respectively cutting stones, that's the angel on the cherub on the left, measuring an image of the church on the wall, and marking out on the ground a schematic cruciform plan of a church with apse and transept. In form and location, including an anticipatory relationship with any superstructure, this is reminiscent both of the miraculous Marian plans that emphasise the outlines of the church and of the plans of the foundations in the Junta Pontificals. A connection with the demarcation of sacred space is reinforced in the accompanying texts. The biblical quotation above the scene reads, "Know ye not that ye are the temple of God, and that the Spirit of God dwelleth in you?" While the text beneath urges the reader to build up such a temple in your heart as my cross marks out in the yielding ground. So I asked you at the beginning to mentally detach for a while the ground plan from the structure above it. This command offers a way of reuniting them, but in a slightly different light. In concentrating on plans marked on the ground and on depictions of those plans, I haven't meant to deny their relationship to the church building. Unlike marks on a football pitch or indeed a car park, which simply shape the movement of the bodies above them, ultimately these lines do relate to built space. Yet I do think that they form a distinct type of holy ground plan, with the potential for realisation not just in terms of practical, but also spiritual building. Thanks.